Welcome to the 60th episode of the interview series. The interview series is a production of 1 Week Critique, an Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit that offers educational resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about us and our programs, or support our work by visiting our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number oneweekcritique.com. Please like and subscribe to help us continue producing excellent content. I'm Jon Riccio, joined today by Dr. Erin Hoover. Erin teaches creative writing and literary editing as an assistant professor of English at Tennessee Tech University. She curates and hosts the in-person poetry reading series, Sawmill Poetry, and produces the Not Abandon, But Abide interview series for the Southern Review of Books. Her debut collection, Barn Burner, won Elixir Press's Anti-Venom Award and a Florida Book Award in Poetry. Erin's second collection, yay, No Spare People, was published by Black Lawrence Press in October. Hoover lives in Middle Tennessee with her family, but was born and raised in central Pennsylvania. In addition to teaching, she's worked as an editor, journalist, fundraiser, and we'll talk about that in the interview, got that in common, and public relations director. You can learn more about Erin on her website, erinhooverpoet.com. Welcome, Erin.
Yeah, thank you, Jon. I'm so happy to be here. And yes, I've had many jobs besides being a professor. So
I am so grateful that No Spare People is my re-entry into 1 Week Critique after a 5-month hiatus. My serendipity believing self says, of course, No Spare People got me back on track at the same time my students were learning about feminism through such characters as Mrs. Mallard in Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, and Mama Benitha in Ruth in Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. I formulated this very question on the eve of my literary interpretation classes diving into research papers, one student preparing an annotated bibliography that illuminates their claims on Georgiana's non-autonomy in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark, while meta-toggling over to The Scarlet Letter. Hawthorne, who's referenced in your book's penultimate poem, Forms and Materials, about his famous character, the woman in A Awakened. The male novelist wrote, "The world's law was no law for her mind." Hawthorne's scientist, Almer, is a cousin one genre removed from the men in your poem, 3 Weeks, who don't think women are people at all. Your end notes tell us No Spare People enacts a set of material realities bound by time, place, and social position with an interest in feminist theory. The perspective is limited by design. Thus, I chose epigraphs from Living a Feminist Life by Sarah Ahmed, Duke University Press, 2017, and Adrienne Rich's Notes Toward a Politics of Location, from a lecture from the Conference on Women, Feminist Identity and Society, 1984. What are the most impactful tenets of feminist theory that you share in the classroom, and who would comprise your dream panel of feminist poetry written between 1973 and 2023?
yeah, thanks for that question. I would go back. I mean, I don't mean to skirt the question, but I would go back to Adrienne Rich and Sarah Ahmed again, because they're so foundational to kind of the way I write and teach, and those are all tied together. For Rich, language is material, and materials are kind of that's worth making art about. Your kind of personal life and your experience in the world. And then I would say with Sarah Ahmed's book, Living a Feminist Life, I mean, she's not the only one to say this, but to be critical does not only mean to break things, it means to make things. It means to generate something new and better. It's not only picking things apart, it's building up. And I think that's true. I mean, in terms of what I'm teaching, I want them to be exact. I want their work to be grounded, not only in the books we're reading, but in the lives we're living. And then I think also, I think criticism gets a bad rep. And in fact, it can be constructive. I think when you're criticizing something, it is with an eye to be constructive. So those are both in my teaching all the time, and in my life all the time. So your question, also, I noticed like 1973 there. I was like, oh, okay, that limits it a little bit, because I am in some ways kind of a second wave poetry girl, and the poetry I grew up really studying in the 90s, which was when I was doing my first study of poetry, was a lot of like lesbian poetry from the 70s, a lot of like confessional kind of that kind of feminism, and that kind of looking at sexuality as well. Adrienne Rich was part of that, obviously, so she kind of comes from that. But so for panelists, I thought about this. I would like to talk to June Jordan. I would like to talk to Muriel Rukeyser. I would like to talk to Juliana Spar, Amanda Gorman, and Franny Choi. Those are my girls that I'm going to put on this panel. And so why? Each poet has produced a body of work that's explicitly about feminism, an embodied feminism that has to do with how you live your life and that has real political stakes. I would say all of those writers, maybe not all of them, but most of them have done some theoretical work in addition to creative work, commenting on language in relationship to material concerns. And if I were to ever do like a feminist theory panel, I would want it to be intergenerational. So I tried to kind of go from, Muriel Rukeyser with, I think she has 2 books that came out after 1973. So she's just in there. But up to Franny Choi and Amanda Gorman, who are younger than me. So I think I would love to hear them talk. I know it would be interesting.
Hmm.
Also, I think, you want people, I always play the dinner party game. Who would you have over to a dinner party? I think you want people who are going to be able to hold their own in that discussion, and who believe that their experiences are valuable and merit having an opinion. That's something I teach too. It's not something that I always believed about myself. I was not always encouraged to value my own kind of thoughts and opinions about things, which I think is foundational to me becoming a writer in the first place. So, thanks, former English teachers, for that. I was like, no, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. So yeah, I think a good opinionated discussion would result. I also just want to call out Rukeyser's interest in documentary poetics, which predates 1973, but she has that great Katha Kollwitz poem. Maybe what would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. I think I read that when I was 19 years old, and that poem really affected me. So thanks for that question.
Sure. When I was at University of Arizona, Susan Briante was doing work and still is with docupoetics. So it was probably around my 2014 was when I was more familiarized with it. And I've just had panels on the brain lately because what I've been doing with my students is they're finishing up their research papers. We had our presentations at theoretically, since I built them a timeline, you could be at the 75% of the way paper written on December 5th, which was also when the presentations were occurring. So the moment they walked into class, I said, I've conferred PhDs on all of you, and we are traveling to a conference not in Las Vegas. That's overdone. We're going to Reno because I like that airport and it's closer to the Sierras. And you are all going to give your panels presentations on the state of literary interpretation post 2020, because it seems like there's always, if you can put a post in there with some kind of hyphen, the panel
Yes.
just has that panel magic. And I made it a point to call all of them doctor. And what I loved about that was some of my students actually, this little glow lit up, and they're thinking, okay, this could be the English major life, the MA or the MFA, and then going on to the PhD. This could be for me. And I'd love to think that maybe I opened the door just a little more for those who just hadn't quite seen that as a possibility. And
Yeah. Maybe 2020
also,
is the new 1945.
ooh, good. That is
I don't
quite.
know. Could be. We'll have to see what develops. We're only 3 years in, so
Mhm. And of course, with those conferences, I always get onto the subject of, and you'll be seated at a nice table, and more than likely you'll have this crystalline pitcher because they always get out the best pitchers at these conferences. They pull out all the stops, which leads us to this second question about the hedge fund manager's first wife, because it reminded me of my fundraising background and the wealth and the accoutrements, and particularly this passage. She chaired the gala event for my employer, a charity. One day, the hedge fund manager and his second wife would pose for reporters behind a sheet of dollar bills, uncut Washington green. But this was then. Inherited New York money bought their pirate ship of windows floating 300 feet above Park Avenue. It bought our charity, our group of women, and me, nearly lowest of all. That pirate ship of windows cued ostentatious flashbacks in homes of hobby philanthropists. We're talking mermaid molded faucet handles, wallpaper pandas in this tug of marble sink war. The one case of inherited wealth did result in my first taste of pine nuts on some really good chicken. And it happened to be on the most just embossed of embossed plates. It could have won first prize in the embossest plates competition. And the wait staff that comes and cracks open your Diet Coke for you, and basically they pour it into the goblet. I recently gave my students a packet of poems with money as their unifying subject. Brenda Hillman's Species Prepare to Exist After Money, and Ray Armantrout's Money Talks among them. Armantrout's poem ends, on a billboard by the 880, money admonishes, shut up and play, which gels with the wife in your poem who told us our ads should be in town and country, Vogue, the Hamptons mags, the right people, she said, couldn't see us. Placement, placement, placement. What aspects of putting a collection together most resemble planning a gala?
okay. That poem is interesting because it takes place at, it's at a specific time. She's the first wife, so she's still married to the kind of hedge fund guy who will go work in Washington. So the poem is about the interplay of wealth and politics in some way and how influential they are. But she's soon to be deposed, right? She's
Mm,
currently the first wife, but we already have, because we know the future, we know there's going to be a second wife who's going to kind of be the Washington wife, and she's going to be discarded. So the poem takes place at a really specific point in time. And I just tried to really freeze a lot of this book is me freezing little moments in time from the 90s and from the early 2000s, and trying to connect where we were then to where we were now. But yes, I did work on planning galas. I did work in fundraising for over 7 years. And it doesn't surprise me that you worked in fundraising, because so many good people do, honestly. If you work in fundraising, you will probably work with someone very, very cool, I think. And I think there's probably a version of the world where I'm still a director of communications somewhere, or a vice president of something. But I had this kind of like, you must change your life moment that resulted in me leaving that profession. So anyway, how is it like planning? How is putting a collection together like planning a gala? And I remember thinking this back in the days of being part of creating the gala experience. You can set everything up, you can make everything arranged. You're trying to create an experience, I was always told, right? For your guests to have. You can do whatever you're going to do to set it up, but you can't ultimately control their experience. I think people, anyone attending a gala is going to walk in with their own set of concerns that day, or their own perspective on who they are and what they're doing there. So you do your best, right? Like, you're not maybe going to serve chicken cordon bleu because they've had that at every other gala you've been to this year. You're not going to have a silent auction with prizes put together by PR firms. You're going to have really bespoke, particular, beautiful prizes that people are going to want to bid on. You are not going to have B-list celebrities at your gala. You want the best, kind of the most symbolic, most representative figures at your gala or in your book, right? You want everything in your book to mean something, just like everything signifies, well, not just at a gala, but in the world. Everything signifies in your collection you're putting together. So I think I want for the reader, I think of the reader as having an experience in my book, and I think about what I've experienced in other books that I really enjoyed and liked and want to emulate. So, I think I've been successful in this way with No Spare People, because people have told me that they do maybe see themselves in the book, or some aspect of themselves, or it gives them a new way of looking at a problem or an idea, and that's the experience I want. Not trying to entertain, especially. I'm not trying to garner donations either. But I am trying to get folks hopefully to have an experience with the book. So I hope that answers it.
Definitely. And I
Yeah.
will say I saw my 90s self in many of your poems,
Okay.
the
Yes.
retail list and some of the pop culture references.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you talked about having that standout celebrity aspect. You want the A-lists in your collections, and having done some of the nonprofits where we're lucky if the local meteorologist shows up to be the one who reads out the raffle. I mean, versus, I don't know, the mayor or something. It's there is a definite level of distinction. And
Yeah, so my company, my organization had the same PR firm as Donald Trump.
mm,
So Donald Trump wanted to come to our gala for free.
mm,
And so he actually, we told him that he would have to pay. Um, couldn't get in on his celebrity status then.
mm,
I'm sure he could now, if he wanted to go to the same gala or a similar one. He probably could get in for nothing, but we thought he
mm.
should pay.
Well, that beats my story of trying to fundraise to teach seatbelt safety to the youth of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. There was at one point, and it's always hard to say the name, the Cricket, to instill the values of seatbelt safety. And it was, I believe, just a little dry cleaned costume that just went from county to county. And the time that I fundraised for chainsaw tractor safety, so I would always say if you see farmers in their 30s and 40s with 10 fingers in the mitten state is because they probably, maybe they attended the workshop that I got the funding for. And so,
Oh,
yay, yay for chainsaw safety, right? And
yes.
there are always these ways you can just plug in any, in my case, it was Michigan 4-H youth development. So there's the agricultural aspect, there's the animal science aspect, there was, the state awards. So, and that event involved pageantry and dry smoke and maybe even some dry ice. And so they had, and my kind of wake up call in the fundraising world would have been about 2008, but I was still in it right before I left for my MFA up until 2013, but overstayed that party by about 5 years.
No, around the same time. Around the same
Hmm.
time, I stopped doing it in 2012.
Hmm.
But the background has served me well.
Oh,
Yeah,
it makes for the most interesting stories and
true.
donors. And did you ever do those Indiana University workshops where they would have these trainings where you would go and you would learn how to talk about asking for $1,000 donations, or you would learn how to talk about interpersonal communications, and it was 2 or 3 days. And
Oh,
this,
I didn't do that. No, was a communications writer and publicist mainly. So, and a lot of it was just, being taught by doing.
mm,
Um, it's interesting because I work with a lot of English majors, and they sometimes say, well, should I major in marketing or should I major in communications, or what's most directly going to get me the job that I want? And I mean, I never took a communications class. I've never
mm,
taken a marketing class. I mostly stumbled through it,
mm,
and learned from other people doing it. So, but no, that would be an interesting class to go to. I would like to
yeah.
know how to ask for $1,000.
It was fun, and
Yeah.
there was between jobs I would do pro bono consulting, travel
Hmm.
around Michigan, and make PowerPoints to the lowest of my technological capabilities, but they got the point across. And
Yeah.
different chapter before the poetry world. In your poem At the Child Support Office, you write, I see a father listed, the clerk said, and told me a French name, man piloting a swamp boat through my imagination, a stranger who, peering under our car seat bonnet, would be as confused as I am at how the state of Florida found a husband for me, clerical error of a man. In response, I supplied the Latinate words that conjured my baby, artificial insemination, for all to hear, handing over the letter I asked my doctor to write. My word, I had to do that. Get a letter like that. I've learned that I can't tell people what they don't already believe, but I fought for that blank space. What I love about this passage is the contrast between such phrases as man piloting a swamp boat through my imagination and the declaration, I fought for that blank space. This I mincemeats the red tape, rolls of it, adhering to the collection's opening poem on the metaphor for women of birthing to creative activity, which ends with the manifesting. It is only the first move to conjure a woman's grievances, and it is past time to make the second. And so I ask her to speak. I call her forth. I open my throat. What are the poetic, not to mention political challenges of an I fending off geo-bureaucracies across the span of a 70-page collection?
So when I first read this question, I was like, pass. But then I thought more about it, and I thought there are some things that I can say there, which is, um, one of the kind of conceits of the collection, or things that's running through, ideas running through, No Spare People, is subjecthood, one's role as the subject versus constantly, as I feel that I've been throughout my life, the object. And so, in some ways, the content of the book is inspired by my own life, but I get to write it. I'm shaping it into something. And that's, it's, there are privileges and some lack of privilege attached to that particular I, which I think is true in really any collection of poetry. I think this collection is just trying to point that out a little more. Whereas some, I don't know, I'm not speaking about any collection in particular, but some may pretend to have a more objective kind of stance, or may not be as concerned with who's speaking in any particular poem. So the note that you read too, I did also think a lot when I was putting this book together, particularly to the extent that it deals with certain inactions of motherhood or queerness or having a family, or ways that I've done that, or that the character in the book does that. I was nervous that it would be read as trying to overstep and speak more broadly beyond the particular choices of a single person or of a representative person. Hope that makes sense. I didn't want to be kind of grandstanding, as I think sometimes a text that wades into political territory can kind of maybe seem to do. I wanted the book to be political, but I didn't want to claim to be speaking for people that I'm not speaking for, or speaking for anyone else. So I had passed the book by C.T. Salazar, another poet, and something that he recommended was to look at Jenny Johnson's liner notes in Full Velvet, where she's just really honest about how she came to write the poems and what was influencing them and what her thought process was. So, the thinking was, let's just put a note in there that kind of externalizes that and says what I was trying to do. So that's what that note, I think, was trying. That was my intention with that kind of note. But at the same time, then that note does hopefully, get people to look at the book and say, oh, she is trying to do something with this I here, to comment on the positionality of the speaker. Something Barnburner did too, but maybe a little less explicitly. So yeah, I mean, to the extent of writing a book and publishing a book and kind of platforming an I, at the same time, I'm also trying to be realistic about who that I is.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I noted eco-critical links in these sections of your poem, Death Parade. Reiterating my memories of 9/11 hardens them, separates me from them. While I want to move closer to turpentine away their finish. In the restaurant where I worked, a paramedic asked me if I knew what we were breathing in. I said I'd read it was the contents of the World Trade Center, filing cabinets and computers charred and transformed into tiny particles. Bodies, too, she said. The buildings contained people. I wept at the time, but when I share that anecdote, it enters the minds of others and means less to me. And then following that, there's the terrors of years ago have quit offering useful advice. When I was a kid, everyone talked about Love Canal as a toxic dumping ground or radiation from 3 Mile Island. And today, no one talks about either. This semester, a few of my students wrote on eco-criticism. I found them such poems as Matthew Olsman's Letter to Someone Living 50 Years from Now, Camille Dungy's Characteristics of Life, and Anthropocene Years by D.G. Nanook Akpik, an instruction marking her poem's conclusion. Place fogged lenses on telescopic eyes. Here, brilliant colors of pollution so high. Here, in the melt sun, heaving waters of ocean and sea. Here, start ending double rate heat. To sweat and yet, not yet. Here, wake up there, not here. Those here's are a reminder that one cannot deflect a disaster when fallout rings proximal. About her New York City 9/11 aftermath experience, Juliana Spar, one of your panelists,
Yeah. We could chat about
writes,
this when she comes to my panel.
oh, of course, and I'll be there with the water pitcher. So she writes, everyone breathed the ghosts, whether they wanted to or not. What eco tapestries oxygenate no spare people?
Okay. So Barn Burner, in some ways, my first book was more directly connected to, for instance, 3 Mile Island. There's two poems that are about that. Since I grew up in Harrisburg and was uh, 2 months old when it happened, the my childhood was filled with this kind of vague fear about what had happened and what kind of contaminations had occurred. Um, I think I thought about 3 Mile Island a lot around September 11th because there was that same sort of feeling about what had gone on environmentally around 9/11. Um, but I kind of wondered too, like, well, what happened to all? If we don't talk about this anymore, there's this thing that objectively happened. We don't talk about it anymore, but where does all that energy go? Not necessarily, say, I've heard, I think my parents might have said to me once, well, nothing happened. Nobody got cancer. Nothing happened. But the fear and the anxiety and the way that was kind of like a shroud over my childhood happened. So, and not just me, but like, people of the area. And I think September 11th is one of those events that also casts a very, very long shadow. um, I'm reminded now that we have not really been talking about COVID, not you and I, but our broader culture seems we seem to want to quote get past COVID. And but where does that go? Where does all the frustration, anxiety, resentment, feelings of being wronged, feelings of being, having your life torn up the way COVID tore up so many lives? Where does that go? I think that energy goes somewhere. Um, I think that poetry can be really effective, not or effective is the wrong word, but impactful when dealing with eco-criticism or with talking about like the big issue of climate change, climate destruction, and the frustration that I think especially a lot of younger people have about the environment and what is going on, what kind of world we're going to live in going forward because of climate disaster, which was caused by somebody, right? There are people who profited from it. Um, and the poem that probably works with that most directly, in addition to Death Parade, which you just mentioned, and No Spare People, there's also my poem Apartment Home in Florida as Failure of the Imagination, which is sort of about I lived in Florida for 7 years. That was where I got my doctoral degree. During that time, there were 5 hurricanes, including when my daughter's 1 year old, Hurricane Michael hit the panhandle of Florida. It was Category 5. I remember just sitting there going, well, Erin, this is your life. Like, this is where you are with your kid when this hurricane's going to hit, and then sort of dealing with the climate afterwards. um, I lived in a really dark, there are a lot of like little kind of dark, low to the ground apartments in Florida. not a lot of windows. I think it's to conserve air conditioning. I don't know what it is,
Mm.
but a very manufactured environment. Like you couldn't see in the house unless you had all the lights on. You basically had to run the air conditioner all the time. Um, sitting in that dark little apartment, thinking, did I choose this? Is this, or is this a thing that I'm capable of choosing differently within? Can I choose differently within the situation? So you think about that during the time of the aftermath of the hurricane. Then as soon as the lights come on and everything is fine again, it's sort of like you go back to the life you were living before, because it's not really possible to choose differently. I don't think people could argue with me about this, but to choose differently is a very hard choice to make, especially given maybe whatever financial resources a person can have. But you know, that's sort of like a very human frustration that maybe other people have felt, when looking at, we're dealing with climate collapse, and what do we do? What can an individual do? And so I think poetry is a space where at least some of that can be heard, and reckoned with and thought about and kind of gotten through. Because like I said, this notion of like, okay, COVID happened, let's put it away, let's put it in the past. I think we have a lot of processing to do, mentally and emotionally and kind of as a culture, around these big tragedies that we face. So the book that has a few moments where I'm really trying to do that.
Mm.
Um,
I think when you talk about processing these tragedies, my first semester teaching at University of Southern Mississippi was in the fall of 2016. And so in my Comp 101 classes for the analysis unit, I brought in some excerpts from Patricia Smith's Blood Dazzler, which has the talking Hurricane Katrina. And so my students probably would have been born around 1998 at that time. So they would have been 7 when
mhm.
Hurricane Katrina happened. And then the next year, I would have had students that would have been 6. And then the next year, I would have had students that were 5. And then I think by the 4th year, it's just the book and the poems are still powerful, but I'm just wondering how, when you have people who are younger and younger who are living through events, what is their what is the gauge for how they related to it, or how they emotionally pinged off of it at the time? So,
Yeah, well, but I think that there are, I think that certain traumas exist in some kind of relationship to other traumas.
mm,
I wrote Death Parade because I kept during COVID having flashback dreams to September 11th, because it was the way my mind, I was like, okay, here's this like trauma box. Here's this new trauma I'm facing, and let me get out the artifacts of the old trauma to try to understand the new trauma. And so, it's with things like the Great Depression, which is also referenced in the second Death Parade poem in the book. That's something that I'm very far away from. I did not live through the Great Depression. I remember talking to some of my relatives about it, but it's kind of like the thing you're describing, where there's some temporal distance from that tragedy. But I think you can see them as sort of these reflections of kind of a continuum of things that keep happening,
mm,
um, which now seem to happen faster and closer together than maybe
mm,
they used to. So I think younger generations, like our students, have no lack of trauma. They have quite a lot of it. Um, but it could be possible to learn from or think about some of the older traumas and to see them in relationship.
and they're more forthcoming about trauma too than I would say when I would have been an undergrad.
Yeah, that's true. That's I love that about them. Yeah. Um, so yeah, I mean, now that I'm teaching students who were not born when September 11th happened, which was an event that was kind of like so pivotal to me,
Mhm.
it can be odd when it comes up in a book.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. sometimes I feel the need to explain certain things.
Mhm. And that's
Um,
sometimes where new historicism helps me out when I just well, here's a theory we'll go to and it will fill in some gaps
yeah,
but it only stretches so far in the sort of explanations side of things. And then that's where you do have those more in-depth conversations and you go back to that time machine and you're thinking, okay, September 11th. I remember I had shaving cuts and I was one of the probably the last people on the earth that still put the toilet paper where the shaving cuts were. And that's what I
yes,
remember about that morning.
yeah, yeah. The poem "Death Parade" is in part about can I even trust some of those moments, or like
Mm,
what do they sig what placeholder work are they doing?
mhm,
And again, this is just I'm just one person thinking about this, but I've spent decades thinking about it now.
mhm,
So, it in some ways it's kind of that younger our students, younger people don't carry all of that. But I don't know. It's worth learning. It's worth learning from these other things that have happened before because
mhm,
they lead to one another as well.
mhm.
Um,
Preparedness and response, definitely.
yeah, yeah, or we live in a post 9/11 economy, it's I'm of an age where for most of my adult life we've been in some form of recession.
Mhm,
I mean, I think younger generations relate to some of that too, because some of them feel like, well, what chance do I really have? I'm sorry, this is getting very, very sad, but I mean, if not poetry, to think about some of the stuff where
mhm,
there's public policy, obviously. um, but public policy is expected to present a solution. Poetry allows you to, I think, feel or or
mhm,
or intellectually feel your way through something.
mhm. And I like how you're talking about intellectually feeling your way through something because, again, what I've told students is when it comes to writing these larger scale projects, be technician, but then I also say be imagination. You have those
Hmm.
two balance out.
Yes, yes.
You and Shelley Wong are my patron saints for the how-tos of book touring. Shelley discussed her experiences in a past interview, and I saw that you gave a November reading with another one-week critique interviewee, Rena Shirali. And you're featured at a number of venues in Tennessee, Alabama, and Louisiana. I'm wondering if on the tour, if you've read the poem Real Arkansas, which begins, "It's easy in the South not to get invited anywhere, hard as a dime to parse public niceties from the truer private kind, a barbecue where I can join the conversation. Later, the speaker wonders, have I driven past miles of irrigated fields by the interstate, blanched tufts in bloom, and acknowledged their surface aesthetics before digging into the carnage beneath? How does Real Arkansas and the two poems that come before it, White Woman, which points out the men in my state clean up, and so do I. But if prettier is a door to walk through, where does it ever get me? And maternity exhibit as the singularity, its sentence, how easily they could put away a mother thought dangerous, heralded by the lines, in every twilight zone where foreknowledge is a curse. How do these pieces elevate No Spare People from the book that comes after Barn Burner to a larger statement about your writing regional journey?
So, yeah, Barn Burner was mostly Pennsylvania and New York, although I wrote it in Florida. It's not so much. if it's a regional, if it's a book talking about a region, it's probably that area of Pennsylvania. This book, No Spare People, I wrote while I was living in Florida, Arkansas, and Tennessee. So so it reflects some of those experiences. I didn't, you know, I don't know to what extent we all plan our lives, but I didn't necessarily know where I would live. Um, but living in the South, I've been conscious of, I'm writing about the experience as both an outsider, and then because of the time spent, which has now been over 10 years, to some extent an insider. But there's always going to be that kind of outsider piece to it as well. So I have not read Real Arkansas. First of all, I didn't really want to read it in New Orleans. I don't know why. I'm conscious of not wanting to read it in places where I feel like rural southernness may be not, I don't know, how do I put this? Not granted the respect that I want it to be granted. Or people may think I'm joking in a way that I'm actually not joking. Or I'm trying not to punch down, not to make fun. I'm trying to reflect something. But I would like to read it. Maybe I'll read it in my next reading in Tennessee. Um, you know, it's a hybrid of my life in Arkansas and in Tennessee. Arkansas being a place where you could feel, I felt at times, you could feel that this was a place where segregation had been violently halted. It was also why I lived there, was when I think Arkansas was the first legislature to ban gender affirming care. That was when I lived there and when I had students who were undergoing gender affirming care. So I felt like I wanted to write about being in that place. But I moved to Tennessee and now I live next door to an old plantation, where there has been slavery. And yet I'm in this place, but it's not, you can't live with the weight of the history of a place on your shoulders at all times. You also, to what extent does anybody, even someone who's lived in a place, whose family has lived in a place for generations, you don't own and carry that at every single moment of your life. You also exist as a person, both partially inside of it and partially outside of it. So maybe that, if I could say what that poem is trying to do, it's saying, whatever the real Arkansas is, I've missed it. Because I'm still piling on in that poem some of the preconceptions about Arkansas, or about, in some ways, Tennessee and these histories. But it's something we all do. I mean, we all kind of, most people live with an awareness of what happened in the place where they live, and few of us live in places that nobody ever suffered in, especially that no one ever suffered unjustly in. So yeah, we'll see what happens when I read it here.
Well, I would love to be. I mean, and you were just at a Birmingham, right? A bookstore maybe 2 weeks ago.
But I didn't read. I read one poem there, by request of a visitor. That was really like, that was sort of like, that event was a reading without the reading part. It was just the part where you stand around after the reading and you talk to people. That's what a meet and greet is, I guess. I'd never really done one before, but that bookstore, Thank You Books, is really, really a great place. It was nice to be in Birmingham. It's beautiful in Birmingham. I don't know if people who haven't been there know that.
When I would lived in Mississippi, driving up to Michigan, I would go through Alabama, and I missed the fact that they've taken down the Huntsville Rocket, and that was, but then
I never drove by that.
and that would take me into Tennessee, and it usually would be an overnight, and southern Tennessee, then just to get the next half of the day back up to Michigan. So
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, I drove to Birmingham, then to New Orleans the next night, and then I drove back up to Tennessee to do a reading here. So a lot of driving,
Hmm.
driving through the South, um, which, you know, things are closer together. They're not as close as they are in, say, like New York and New Jersey, but
Hmm.
you couldn't do this kind of touring in like California necessarily. You
Hmm.
know, you couldn't do like, oh, I'll be in Portland one day and then I'll just drive to Los Angeles the next day. No,
Hmm.
it's not going
No.
to work. So, um, yeah, it's
Yeah.
been nice to travel around. It's also been nice to do it in a car, rather than a plane.
Oh, I'm not a fan of air
Yeah.
travel. I've just dream tour, just give me the Midwest and here for a day, then drive down here, then drive here, then drive here. Make it go clockwise once and maybe in the next year go counterclockwise. And so,
Yeah.
well, I'd like nothing more than to hear you read baby care instructions. And please share how those last two lines came flawlessly together, which I'll call hashtag sign me up for the Erin Hoover. Now that's ending up homeschool.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Um, so I'll read it and then I'll talk about it a little bit. Baby care instructions. Before you lived, I lived inside my own loathing. Some parents have children to replace themselves, but we're two instead of none. Pushing you on a swing, sunset, my hands on your mammalian back. I remember how everyone thought I'd kill you by mistake, my throat in hives because I believed them. You made me too, daughter, drawing the last sip from a juice box, wisps of hair rising in the dirty breeze. I show you how to kick to propel yourself, and all threat dips like the sun behind the jungle gym. I may have been born a knife, but my daughter won't be a knife, nor its willing sheath.
Mm.
So, yeah, thanks for the compliment on that last couplet. Um, I think what I was trying to do here is use a modern sonnet form to evoke this moment of both the kind of constant fear you have as a parent. Now here it wasn't about the fear of, you know, what will the external world do to my child, but what's the situation between us here in terms of my ability to parent or to be a good parent?
Mm.
Um, because I don't know, maybe readers who have read Barn Burner will get this a little more. My my younger years were not necessarily like you wouldn't think, oh, that person would be a great parent. Um, and there was a lot of skepticism when I decided to become a parent about whether I would be a good parent. In fact, I think I'm a pretty good parent. Um, and I think that, you know, I say you made me too, because having my daughter really did change me. And that's, I mean, that's, if I could say like a theme of the book, it's single parenthood by choice in a way that really changes somebody. Um, but it's this moment where the mother and the daughter are together and the speaker stops being afraid for a minute and thinks everything is going to be fine. And, you know, the daughter won't be sort of always someone maybe striking out. You don't have to repeat what your parents are. Um, yes, I know, like, thanks for sharing that, Erin. But yeah, it was a
Oh,
thing I
I
realized,
still
right?
need that advice. I still need that advice.
It was me realizing you don't have to do that, nor do you have to be, you don't have to be someone who is a kind of product of an abusive culture, or personal abuse, nor do you have to be someone who is kind of the entity that takes that abuse.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the reasons I think for me becoming a parent has been really powerful. It's like I can't correct certain quote mistakes, or I can't change the past, but I do feel like I can really do my best, as I think all parents really try, for their kids to you know extract them from whatever cycle they may have been part of themselves.
Mhm.
So
Thanks.
yeah, and so that image of that final image of the knife and the sheath, when I found that, I thought, well, that's how I'm going to end this poem, because it's like such a departure from the imagery before it, but it's in the same family of feeling, you know. So it's, I think in some ways that image is both surprising, but also to a reader doesn't feel like, hey, what is she talking about, you know,
Mhm.
because you've been set up for it.
Yeah. Well, we've reached that interview moment where we look at two versions of a poem, early draft and the piece's final form. You've selected My Generation is Not Lost, but We Are Losing. And through the magic of the shared screen, we will be able to view if you could read first the draft and then the final version, and then share your revision process and any additional takeaways you'd like. And I'll queue up the shared screen. And let's see, here it is.
Okay, yeah, it's been a while since I looked at this one. Um, I'll read this one, the first version first. Yeah, okay. My generation is not lost, but we are losing. In the good economy, I boarded puddle jumpers for job interviews at rural campuses, shook the hands of faculty whose pinched mouths showed they were tired. Dutifully, they moved me from building to building so I could lecture their pretend students. So many parking lots to cross, their yellow taped areas blocking off landmines where other candidates had exploded. I was a champion, the fattest and most entitled cow, and I interviewed in person for 2 years. Once the bad economy began, I learned to flatten myself to fit on a screen, so determined I was to survive. I bared my polished teeth and told the faculty in assertive yet modulated tones that I could teach anything. I made my promises to muted laughter, to faces hidden on Zoom. In the cities, hospital workers bagged the dead and nurses protested for masks on camera, footage we all watched late into the night. I couldn't sleep either. I began sending emails to people I knew, friends that I imagined were better connected. They began, I'm reaching out to see, or I'm wondering if you know someone who might need, but no one had time to answer me. A police officer knelt on the neck of George Floyd, crushing his pharynx, as police had done all along to Black people. But here it was on video. Everyone I knew had long, self-righteous opinions about the protesters, about the use of the word riot when applied to people gathered in the open. On long email chains and on social media, educators created workshops to help themselves teach during a crisis as their students gave up entirely on school. I too said, fuck it. I drove to the border of my dry county and bought large quantities of vodka, drank enough of it to blur my vision. I threw my expensive pens, my interview suit, into the open sewer of a nearby lake. I've alienated everyone, I told my family. Imagine, I told my congressman, wanting to fit somewhere. Like so many others, I'd not been given what I was promised. Have you ever felt like that? I said to no one. Looking in the bathroom mirror, I spoke my outsized vows. I swore that I once had a purpose.
Mm, okay, so there's the draft, and now we will go to the final.
Okay. My generation is not lost, but we are losing. In the good economy, I boarded puddle jumpers for rural campuses, shook the hands of faculty whose pinched mouths showed they were tired. Dutifully, they moved me from building to building so I could lecture their pretend students. So many parking lots to cross, taped off areas blocking off landmines where other candidates had exploded. I was a champion, the fattest and most entitled cow, and I interviewed in person for 2 years. Once the bad economy began, I learned to flatten myself on a screen, so determined I was to survive. I bared polished teeth and told the faculty in assertive yet modulated tones that I could teach anything. I made my promises to muted laughter, to faces hidden on Zoom, while in the cities, orderlies bagged bodies and nurses protested for masks, footage we all watched late into the night. I couldn't sleep either. I began sending emails to people I knew, friends that I imagined were better connected. They began, I'm reaching out to see, or do you know someone who might need? But no one had time to answer. No one could turn off the news. Some watched the news for years straight. Some became the news, swallowing whole its desolation in cyclical packages of footage, learning to frame the fracture in their own lives as reportage. I posted volumes of stupid shit. Agents of the state murdered George Floyd, and I resented what I had. My disinfected echo chamber, this performance layered over the dead. There's a record of what I did, days time-stamped by email, how I tried. I built pedagogy workshops as my students gave up entirely on school. I drove to the border of my dry county and bought a handle of vodka, drank to blur my vision. I wanted to be as useless as a governor. I threw my expensive pens, my interview suit into the open sewer of a nearby lake. I've alienated everyone, I told my family. Imagine, I whispered into the voicemail of my congressperson, wanting to fit somewhere. I hadn't found my purpose, or was it lost? In the bathroom mirror, I made outsized vows become necessary. I swore again to be good.
Nice.
Thank you. So the first change I think people will note is that the poem is now lineated. It's in couplets instead of the long prose form. I think I wrote it in as a prose poem initially because I was very struck by the images. I wanted to capture a succession of images, and I didn't really want to worry about lineation yet. But then I didn't quite know what to do with it. But I think that as a prose poem, it reads pretty flat. In some way, you don't have, first of all, you don't have the space to really contend with some of the imagery. You're sort of presented with one image after another without a lot of kind of stanzaic organization. You also don't have the ability to use line break to punctuate some of the things that are being said. So I think lineating the poem was a good decision. Good work, Erin. I think I'm glad I made that decision. On one hand, I think the other thing is there are some, I would say maybe some things that were almost like, if you're mixing a song, you're pushing some elements of the song forward, pulling back some others. I think I kind of remixed this poem in a way so that some things became more prominent and some things became less prominent. The first version of the poem I feel is more critical of people around me, or of more who are around the speaker and their reactions to kind of the disaster of the economy, the situation of COVID. There's a lot of kind of criticism of the way white people in particular are processing the death of George Floyd. You know, and I realized, like, regardless of whether that's true for any one particular speaker at the time, that's not what I wanted the poem to be about. I didn't want it to be about criticizing other people and their reaction to trauma. I also tried to, in some ways, I mean, there's a little bit of like subtle humor there. In some ways, I wanted to be as useless as a governor. I think that line is new. That comes, thank you to our governor of Arkansas for inspiring that line. Arkansas never closed down during COVID. So when I found that line, or when I wrote that line, I was very happy with it. I tried to be more blunt in the way I was presenting the death of George Floyd. Just say what it was and say why it bothered me. Rather than in some ways focusing on the violence done to his body, I wanted to focus on the symbolic violence of the act. because that was what I think was troubling. So there are places I kind of smoothed out in that way. I also wanted to bring out the way during that time, not just me, but I think a lot of us had really strange relationships with the news, both with the news we were watching and with the news we were creating out of a feeling of powerlessness. I mean, that's what I think all that social posting was. And the speaker says I posted volumes of stupid shit. Yes. You know, if anyone looks at my timeline on Facebook, I mean, feel free to note the stupid shit I posted. A lot of very kind of like, I wasn't alone in doing this, like making these kind of declarative posts about the news around me, as though I was like working for CNN, like I'm going to report on, like, you know, I don't know, it like became, the situation at that time was very ridiculous, which the poem begins that way. Um, you know, I was on an actual job interview, and I did make a presentation to pretend students because there were no students because it was COVID. So, you know, try to teach a class to pretend students sometime. It's really interesting. You get to invent their questions. So that's fun. I also remember walking by a taped off area and thinking to myself, well, that must be where the other candidate exploded. I was like, okay, I'll just put that in the poem because that it was absurd. It's absurd to go on pretend job interviews during a pandemic, not to mention risky health wise. So that poem, I think, I wanted to draw out the absurdity, but also not focus it on others so much as build, like, kind of fold the speaker more into the context of the poem, which the end line changes as well. I swore again to be good. I want that to be a line that is a little troubling, or a little ambiguous, because is the speaker doubling down on the failed system that has produced kind of this weird pandemic economy, or is the speaker kind of trying to say they really do want to be good? I don't know. You know, there's a kind of scary determination there, which I think anyone who was looking for a job during COVID or is looking for a job now probably understands, where you're like, I'm going to get a job. Like, I don't care what it takes. So that's in that poem, and that poem, my generation is not lost, but we are losing. That sort of relates to the economic situation that I mentioned earlier, that I think people in my generation find themselves in, and people coming after us also feel this. Like, where are the good times? I did take out the line about being promised things because that felt like I had heard it elsewhere, in relationship to generational kind of economic turmoil. I felt I had heard that elsewhere. So I took that out. But this poem ends the first section of my book. There are two sections in No Spare People. This poem ends the first section. So I intended it to be an important poem in some ways. I intended it to also make the reader want to read onto the second section. You know, to I think, I've been told that both of my books are books that are maybe not easy to read, but books that make you want to read the next poem. And that's something I thought about putting it together. I mean, maybe it's kind of like where you arrange tables in the gala, John. I don't know. Like, you know, if you look at one silent auction item, you want to get the person to look at the next one, not just kind of turn away in annoyance. Because you want them to bid. So I wanted, it's not a cliffhanger poem, but you do want to think, okay, what's going to happen to this person? And then the first poem of the second section is Visiting Assistant Professor. So, you know,
And
they do get a temporary job.
And I know, so, and it's the word timestamp. And as the poet, I'm always looking at portmanteaus and compound words. And timestamp, it seems to be the compound word that is forever dogging us in our post 2020 lives. And when I think right when Mississippi shut down, it was March. It was, I call it the day Hattiesburg ran out of toilet paper. And
Yeah, not just Hattiesburg.
right.
Yeah.
And it was surreal though, just to see, okay, because little by little, early March, the big Charmin, it starts to dwindle and you see more and just then you would go into the store because we heard the announcement on Thursday, there will be no more school in person. And we had an extra week of spring break in which we pivoted to figuring out how to turn
You're the
all of our
same plan we had, yes.
academic lives into teaching online. And what I think in those spring COVID months, April and May, tail end of March, I think I just dove into, because I was finishing up my PhD and I was teaching an intro to poetry workshop. And I was just figuring out, okay, and it was Canvas. So how do I record myself giving these lectures? And then I was also working on the layout for an anthology of poems from the Community of Writers Workshop. We met in the summer of 2019 and the editorial staff had made the decisions about all the submissions, and I want to say maybe January. And so just the word layout, and even at Mississippi Review, we were finalizing the layout of the prize issue it was going to go out early summer-ish. So thinking about how does the word layout apply then to how one spent those early pandemic months and just the way you are trying to figure out the pagination of, just to take it to a broader the pagination of one's life, or how does this action, should I do this action on this day, or is it a matter of just going out to the store, double masked up just on this certain day of the week when there probably will be a lower volume of people. And it's kind of like when you're moving around poems and figuring out, well, where do I end this and how do I wind down my day versus how do I wind down the first section of my book. And so,
But we had to hyper focus on every action. When you were going to go to the store, there's also like, you formerly had a lesson plan
mhm,
to be delivered in person. A lot of us had been, I know one class I was teaching at that time was nonfiction. I taught creative nonfiction before. So I was using some of, very changing up, but a variety of the lesson plans I had been using. And then it becomes as simple as, okay, well, these were the questions I used to have for class discussion, but are they going to work in an online context? Are these still good discussion questions? Or do they need to be, we were taught all sorts of different ways to use technology, very intentional ways to use technology. So it's like, okay, how do I put that? Do I layer that on top of my discussion questions? Do I come up with new questions? And it's like, meanwhile, you're going through, the trauma of the time happening with a hyper awareness of every decision you're making, and then it all becomes a blur. The images that shocked me at the time, such as the morgue trucks in New York, there were a number of shocking images coming out of New York on the news. Now they've become almost like, it's like the same experience I have with thinking of the imagery around September 11th.
mhm.
Like it's become common, it's part of the image family we associate with this disaster. At the same time, it's a striking image. Like I'm not going to take it out. I toyed with taking those things out of the poem, but what other image? I don't know. That was the image that struck me at the time. So that, there's both the retrospective looking back at the event, but also the trying to honor what were the things that were striking at the time. Time stamped, right?
Yeah,
My
one of the
time stamped
first
impression of the event.
uh,
Um,
one of the first poems I recorded for my pivot lecture in the introduction to poetry workshop was Plath's Fever 103. And ironic because that's at the height of, here's the COVID pandemic that is upon us, and one of the symptoms is this uncontrollable fever. And just so then a word, you're going through that poem and you're recording it, and you come to a word like acetylene, and it all of a sudden it takes on a new meaning at the when you're supposed to be on the lookout for if you have any acetylene sort of temperature spikes. And but I
Yeah.
also one of the more interesting things though is I did start reaching out to people in terms of fiction writers, just to keep myself busy. I because I love helping people figure out, well, how might you take your poem and revise it, or how might you revise your nonfiction? But that was, I just said, I will start reaching out to friends and seeing if they have any fiction they'd like me to read for just to offer my 2 cents and to build this bridge. And
Hmm.
so the fiction reading antenna were cultivated while just trying to figure out how to then navigate because and maybe even I think 3 days before the Mississippi shuts down is when I went and put my deposit on the gown for the graduation ceremony that never happened. So it's
Oh, did you
the
get it
the
back?
fan I believe I did the phantom graduation ceremony, right?
Yeah, right.
So,
Yeah. I mean, something that I'm sort of, or that I've accepted, which is true, or maybe I even like that it's true, is that the the book takes place in actual places and has actual times associated with it. And it's, if you're writing about something like COVID and teaching during COVID, I'm doing that now, right? It's like 3 years later. I guess I probably wrote this poem not so soon after. But it's an observation that takes place at a distinct time.
mhm.
We were always told, I don't know if you were told this, but this was back in the day. I don't know if people do this anymore, but you want to write these things that are somehow timeless, or which speak to, someone 200 years from now is going to be able to relate to it as much as somebody now. It's like Shakespeare or something. All the things Shakespeare wrote about are still true. Um, but I don't. I think the more I've written, the more I've just sort of given that up, or thought, I'm not sure I care about that anymore. Because I think human beings are flexible enough and have enough research skills that they will be able to conceive of a time in which the thinking was maybe different than their own thinking in whatever their present is. Um, and if they don't know what COVID is, maybe someone will tell them. I don't know.
Or
I
they'll
think
come
well, I think
across
we'll
an
always know what COVID is, but
mm,
yeah. I mean, it's got to be part of the literature of our time, right? Is the things that are happening during our time. Um, I
nothing
think,
timestamps like an anthology.
yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Sometimes a single word is all it takes for me to bridge two poets. So when you use the word crockery and forms and materials, and it's in these lines, wield neither chainsaw nor crockery, a holy conundrum this blank will not fill, but an example I set. So I've got the word crockery, and I'm thinking, I love this word when it comes into poems, and it's specifically I'm thinking of Carmen Jimenez's Parts of an Autobiography, and this is entry 86. I want bathos, a sinking in the viscosity of feeling. If I can make something lovely of my broken crockery, then I shall. Jimenez's work contains 111 entries in all, and it's found in her 2013 collection, Milk and Filth, and it's one of the longest poems in that book. Just as Forms and Materials is No Spare People's, it's the reward marathon. It's got references ranging from Dobbs v. Jackson to Mary Wollstonecraft and what you call the Romance Industrial Complex. In your lines, whispers suggest I'm a casualty of women's lib. My girlhood, a die to keep casting, reminded me of the closing stanzas of Carol Ann Duffy's Mrs. Beast. But behind each player stood a line of ghosts unable to win. Eve, Ashbuttle, Marilyn Monroe, Rapunzel slashing wildly at her hair, Bessie Smith unloved and down and out, Bluebeard's wives, Henry VIII, Snow White cursing the day she left the seven dwarfs, Diana, Princess of Wales. The sheepish beast came in with a tray of schnapps at the end of the game, and we stood for the toast, Fay Ray, then tossed our fiery drinks to the back of our crimson throats. Bad girls, serious ladies, mourning our dead. So I was hard on the beast, win or lose. When I got upstairs, those tragic girls in my head, turfing him off out of bed, standing alone on the balcony, the night so cold I could taste the stars on the tip of my tongue, and I made a prayer, thumbing my pearls, the tears of Mary, one by one, like a rosary. Words for the lost, the captive beautiful, the wives, those less fortunate than we. The moon was a hand mirror breathed on by a queen. My breath was a chiffon scarf for an elegant ghost. I turned to go back inside. Bring me the beast for the night. Bring me the wine cellar key. Let the less loving one be me. Whew. But bringing us back to the Jimenez excerpt, what is the lovely made from forms and materials, and with whom on Duffy's list do you most identify?
Um, so yeah, crockery, I was trying to find an image of domesticity, which maybe Jimenez is as well with that image of crockery. Um, so, I wrote forms and materials last. The book was accepted without that poem. And then, you know, I was literally emailing the finished version of forms and materials to a friend when Roe was overturned the very same day. And so I thought, okay, let me go rewrite that, put Amy Coney Barrett in the poem, um, and try to bring that into it. Um, so the lovely, I would say, and I think the last poem in my book alludes to this as well, is that I'm writing No Spare People against this idea of some people are useful and valuable and some people are not. Some people are extra, some people don't fit. Because they don't fit, they're less valid or their contributions aren't useful. So in the world I would like, the lovely, my family is valuable. My daughter and I are a family. You'd be surprised how often I have to point that out to people, that not only are we a mother and daughter, we are a family as much as any family with a two parent household, and the things we do together are important. There's the I again, kind of asserting itself. My kind of mothering, chosen mothering, is as important as any other kind. And so the book is called No Spare People. I was so mad at Prince Harry for his book Spare. I was like, stop, because it's sort of like I was like, no, this is what I'm calling my book. But that concept of being extra or not necessary or outside the limits of what is possible or valuable is something I'm pushing up against. And what's interesting about Duffy's poem also, which I had not read before, but really love that poem. What a tremendous poem. They're all the women who can't win. I said my girlhood had died. Keep casting. These are all these women who can't win whenever they're throwing dice or whatever they're gambling. But it's all about pain. It's all about pain and suffering. So all the women mentioned are emblems, I think, of pain and suffering at the hands of others. If you want to take them together, is my interpretation of what Duffy's doing there. And I had written in No Spare People, forms and materials, that poem, pain is always the vehicle, pain is feminine. And I thought that way for some time. In some way, Barn Burner being as much as it is about sexual assault and violence, and addiction is figuring pain as feminine. Um, and I'm not sure I could pick any of the Duffy characters because I would rather pick someone who's not emblematic of pain. So, what if pain no longer ordered the narrative is the last poem in No Spare People. A reviewer called that a grace note, but in fact, I think it's the book's whole point. You know, what if, and I think I could go farther in writing more affirming poems. But at least I'm getting there by the end of the book. So, if I'm thinking about, female characters, I would imagine I would like to be. I think about, what about Queen Elizabeth I? Now she wasn't married, didn't get to live that particular dream on purpose, right? Or Greta Garbo, who gets, wants to choose not to be with someone. Or another person I wrote down, because personally I've just always wanted to meet this person, is Mary Shelley, right? Because her book was so heavily edited by her husband, but the first version that she wrote is better. So I want to be Mary Shelley, maybe without Percy's editing of Frankenstein. That would be great. So these are women doing things that are kind of maybe out of the ordinary. There's a certain amount of privilege that goes into each of these women as well, right? And their ability to do that. But I think I'd rather be Queen Elizabeth I than Diana, the princess, so I hope that answers it.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
I mean, the first time I heard that poem, I was in a community workshop with Tracy Brimhall. It would have been early September or late August of 2012, and it just I remember where I was the day that Princess Diana died. Talk about time stamped. I was in the dorm at my college, and someone just came by and told us what happened. And so I think that having that figure in that poem just brought me back then to talk about my 90s self, right? And I actually brought this poem in for a final end of day with my literary interpretation students, and it's a long poem, and what was great was two of them traded reading stanzas, and that was meaningful to them. And I also just emphasize that there are these women who are gathered at this card game, and think of all the ghosts that could not have that opportunity, and we found a way to tie it into sisterhood and community, and it was just, I think, a good note to end our class on. But it's
an interesting poem that makes you real. It made me really think about gender and gender expectations and interactions, in this case between women and men, how choice is figured within those interactions. So yeah, I mean, I definitely owe that poem by Carol Ann Duffy a few more readings. Mr. Beast, right? It's called.
I think it's let me get Mrs. Beast.
Mrs. Beast. Oh
yep.
yeah, I don't want to miss her, the Mrs. Beast. All right.
And it's in her collection, The World's Wife.
Okay. Yeah, wow. Okay. Yeah, good question.
So you have an interview series, Not Abandon, But Abide. This has been ongoing since October 2022, and you focus on poets who actively resist the notion that we all co-sign the actions of the monoculture. In the introduction to the series, we're told, for this series, I've talked and am still talking to poets I know, especially those with new books coming out or who are involved in literary activism. but I also wanted not abandon, but abide to be a location of discovery for me, as well as anyone who reads these interviews. So I crowdsourced poets to feature. I can only describe this process as an unraveling because it seems the more thread I pull on, the more there is to pull. If I have done my work well, it will be hard to read these interviews without growing curious and possibly hopeful. The poets I've interviewed so far have fed my hope. What interviews can we expect in 2024?
I haven't been working on this series as much since my book came out. I was doing one interview a month,
Mm,
which producing one kind of, well, you're interviewing me. Producing one long interview that is thoughtful in the way you want it to be thoughtful can be difficult to kind of churn those out.
mm,
Um, but something I've noticed with doing them is that as a result, I would go look at catalogs of books coming out. I would do some crowdsourcing. Social media was really instrumental for me in helping me find poets to interview. It is less so now that Twitter is the way it is. In that I feel like a lot of times I don't necessarily see posts I would like to see, or people don't see my posts or whatever. So it's a little harder to crowdsource. So I do more kind of like research based, looking for poets, um, which, this is the work of interviewing and of reviewing and of list making and kind of the literary curation work that I think we need, because if you're outside the poetry world, how do you even know what books are coming out? Like,
mm.
you can't look at Publishers Weekly. They do a seasonal roundup, and that's only certain books. So, I mean, I'm looking at the level below that. I'm looking at the indie presses. I'm looking at the small presses. Um, so an interview that I've started is with Jennifer Conlon, who has a book, Taking to Water, that we've been going back and forth. So that's one that I have that I'm working on. I also want to interview Tana Jean Welch in Florida. It's her second book, in Parachutes Descending, um, which will be out, I think, in January. But those are the only two that I have really like definitely lined up. If anyone's listening to this and they would like to pitch me their book, um, that's totally great. I would love that, because I don't necessarily always know everything coming out. Um, I try to balance things between the print interview series and then the poetry reading series I have here in Cookville, which is called Sawmill Poetry.
Mm.
So that's my literary promotion work that I do. Um, it's at a pretty speedy clip.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I really like doing it. I wish there were more. I do wish poetry was more. I wish it was less gate kept. Yeah, I wish
Mhm.
I wish it I wish you didn't kind of need that, and maybe you don't. But like before I got an MFA, I didn't know how to do any of this. I wish there were more kind of ways to kind of explore different titles. Um, I don't know.
I
Haven't
found that
solved that problem yet.
so before my MFA, it was one community workshop with Tracy Brimhall, one community workshop with Jon Riccio, and then right before I left for my MFA, I was doing a workshop with Denise Miller, who is a poet in Southwest Michigan, and Susan Ramsey, who's also a poet in Southwest Michigan. And I just felt that I wanted to be part of this literary ecosystem, and I had great opportunities at the community workshop level, but I wanted to be in that environment. And what I tell my students is the MFA gave me time and opportunities, and the PhD gave me knowledge and opportunities. And the MFA was knowledge too, but just in different ways. I think I was so fortunate to take a craft class informs. I was grateful to have an internship at the University of Arizona Poetry Center doing their digitization of their reading series, going all the way back to the late 60s and through the present. And but when I got to Mississippi, it was, here are your creative writing classes, here are your literature classes. You have a 10-hour comprehensive exam down the road, and you will have your major figure, you will have your contemporary poetry area, you will have another area that you choose. And so you're looking at what these 2.5 or 3 years leading up to that exam, how you're going to prepare for that, and the knowledge. And it's something now that I'm able to draw on, put it in the bank of PhD Jon, and now it's just for the literary interpretation courses or for the poetry workshops at, for example, online at University of West Alabama, or in the spring I'm doing an undergraduate introduction to poetry workshop at Western Michigan University. So it's split between poetry, it's a creative writing workshop, so poetry and fiction. And by fiction, then I get to tap into the work that I did with Adam Clay at Mississippi Review, because it was poetry, nonfiction, and fiction. So just all of these amalgamation of mentors. And one of the aspects I'm eager to impart to my students is this fact that building a library is not as financially draining as you might think, because there are online resources. You can find poems online. There are, for example, there's an online publisher, Moriah Books, that they publish. Yes, you can buy their authors in print, but William Allegretza publishes free PDFs of all of the physical books he also publishes. So it's a resource. And I know during the pandemic, I found a writing group, and we were just sharing other resources of different websites that made complete collections available.
Well, one of
So
the
that,
best ways I feel like to find out about poets and poetry is to make friends with other poets, which you can do in the MFA. You can also do at the undergrad level, and you can do in a community program.
mhm,
Because that is kind of how I find out too about other poets. And then, I'll see on social media, like, oh, here's this issue of this magazine that came out. I have a poem in it, and I'll go look at the issue, and I'll see other people in whatever issue my friend has posted. And I'll be like, oh, look at that, or like, oh, that person is a book, or, it's like, it's the kind of thing where it happens because you like doing it, you know? And so if someone doesn't necessarily like picking up those threads and following them, it's going to be way harder for them to gain a knowledge base of contemporary poetry.
mm,
I mean, you can sort of externally apply it through a class, in which case you're going to know you're having a curated experience that your professor is kind of producing for you. But I don't know. I was told at one point, like, when you get a PhD, you're supposed to not ever need a professor again. Like, you're supposed to be able to do that research yourself, develop an argument yourself. I mean, I found that to be true, but I don't know that you need a PhD for all that. I think, but it's that kind of tool of following intellectual threads, being curious, having a question, finding context for the question, developing the question, and kind of carrying out the research is something you learn
mm.
academically. I think you can learn it outside of it, but it's definitely, yeah, that's PhD stuff.
And
Yeah, even
one
so, I mean,
thing,
there's a tremendous knowledge of like genre fiction, right?
mhm,
That's passion based research. And it's, I don't know if you call it research, but it's passion based inquiry that people do to find the authors that they like, and you know get really into it. um, it's possible in poetry. It can be done.
one of the things that occurred to me as you're talking about gatekeepers is that this phrase coming up through the ranks. I mean, I just emailed a student yesterday about, if you were to consider an independent study at some point in your career, you could focus, say, on and the friendship of Anne Sexton and Maxine Kumin. And I wrote, they came up through the ranks of the 1960s male-dominated publishing industry, but now 24 hours later, I want to revise it and say they came up through the arts, because ranks is, it's just one of those words that
It's military, isn't it?
mhm.
Yeah, you're using the language of the military to describe the intellectual friendship of two women.
So there
Um,
just needs to be more about the art, and it's the
yeah,
and the gatekeeping, that and there is that defensive connotation with the gate. And
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, so, I mean, I guess I think, I mean, this is just a theory, but I do think that if people are, it's probably not a radical theory, but if you are going to readings and events, engaging with other poets, talking to them about craft issues, just like not in a class session, but like as practitioners. Um, if you're doing a fair amount of reading and looking at other writers, wouldn't it stand to reason that one's work would improve?
hmm,
And that you would that there would be good in I mean that's I've learned through the interview series, through the Not Abandon But Abide interview series I do, like I'm approaching that like here is a chance to ask brilliant people questions and they will answer them. And how amazing is that? Um, it's something I've made time to do. It's but it's not totally I'll just say it's not totally selfless because I get to do it. Which I suppose you get to do this.
again, it goes back to the, I'm writing a research paper, but I don't have to turn it in. I don't have to revise it. And it's just a research paper that turns into a dialogue. And that's, how awesome is that? And
Yeah.
well, thank you again, Erin. Our discussion and a wishbone, that was how, putting together this discussion, these questions, and then the old turkey wishbone, that was how I closed out my November. And here we are, literally at the halfway point of December, timestamp. Now, among the classes you've taught at Tennessee Tech, there's one that's a digital writing practicum, and then there's poetry, form, genre, theory. Could you see these classes hybridizing down the road?
Um, okay. So good question. Um, the digital writing practicum was actually for a graduate student who couldn't take other available options. So that was kind of like an independent study. I do believe in, at the graduate level, that practicum-based work is really useful. It could be done hybridly. There's no reason why it has to be done in person. In fact, for an independent study, it could be totally supervised remotely. Um, but our classes at Tennessee Tech are really very at this point they're mostly in person. Um, but I think in order to grow, there's an interest in hybrid courses and online courses. I think that's true for anyone at a university that's not kind of an elite, you know, small liberal arts college on the East Coast. I think most other universities are interested in hybrid programs and online programs. And I've done coursework about, teaching and doing that kind of teaching because I'm so certain that's the case. That it's necessary to it's not something you just transition to without investing in some kind of learning about it. I think I had to learn to teach hybrid courses, and I had to learn to teach online. Um, a Tech's Master of Arts program in English is seeking to become a hybrid program. That's not approved yet, but it's something we're seeking to do. And I created a course that will be required of all the MA students called Publishing Theory and Practice. So that's something I'm excited about. And that would be a hybrid course. But you need to be in the MA in English to take it. And it would have to be in the future because it's not there yet. But it's something I'm excited about. For that class, students can do an entrepreneurial publishing proposal for their final project. So they can think about some sort of project they'd like to do, drawing on kind of the text technologies and other kind of editing and publishing stuff we're learning in the class. Like, what kind of media object would they want to produce? I love getting students to think about that stuff. I think it's really interesting. So yeah, I don't. But to your first question, I don't know about the other two classes you asked about, but certainly there will be some hybrid offerings that I'll be working on.
Nice. And where might readers, if they want to hear you in person, are there any readings coming up, say maybe January when this probably will post?
Well, there will be one at Tennessee Tech. Maybe I can read. Maybe I can read Real Arkansas at the reading. That'll be at January 25th. And then I'll be at the AWP, the Association of Writers and Writing Programs Conference in Kansas City in early February. I have a panel that I'm doing on teaching, publishing, also a panel on reading series in the South with a few other people who run reading series in Southern states. And I should be hopefully doing a reading with my press. That'll be an offsite reading that people can attend to hear me if they want. So yeah, it'll be a busy time. I am going to the Saints and Sinners Festival in New Orleans in March. Another event I'll be doing. And then in April, I'll be at Malaprop's Books in Asheville for their Poetrio event. That'll be in early April. So those are the events that I know of. There may be a Washington D.C. reading in there towards the end of spring as well.
These sound like great road trips.
Yeah. My daughter, by the way, comes with me to some of the readings. She's not going to go to Saints and Sinners, and she's not going to go to AWP with me because that's just too much. But she came to Birmingham and sat at the table with me. She came to the New Orleans reading and played with a cat in the bookstore while I was reading. So yeah, they're good road trips. And I just really like the chance to talk about the book and to share it. I love poetry events. And I like doing them in person. I'm very glad I can do them in person.
Thank you again. No Spare People, Dr. Erin Hoover, the knowledge, and I appreciate all this discussion we had today about poetry, and have a great 2024.
Yeah, thank you. You too, Jon.
Great. Hopefully we'll run into each other one of these days.